This is Deep Night Whispers. Tonight, we open a file that was never meant to be found. In 1857, a photograph was taken in the quiet town of Montgomery, Louisiana. At first glance, it seemed to show nothing remarkable. Two women seated together on a porch, their faces turned toward the sunlight. They are dressed alike, full skirts, tight bodices, lace collars. Their expressions are calm, dignified, familiar. To the untrained eye, it is a portrait of companionship, perhaps sisters, perhaps friends. The kind of image meant for a parlor wall, a memory of civility. But history has a way of hiding its cruelties in plain sight. One of the women in the photograph was a free white woman named Eleanor Gray, daughter of a cotton magnate who owned land along the Red River. The other, her friend, as the family album once called her, was Clara, an enslaved woman born on the same estate, trained from childhood to serve her mistress in all things. The photograph, long forgotten, would be rediscovered more than a century later. And when the truth of it surfaced, it forced historians to confront one of the most disturbing relationships of the antebellum South, the phenomenon later known as companion slavery. Eleanor and Clara had grown up together, inseparable from birth. They slept in the same nursery, ate from the same kitchen, and played under the same magnolia trees. The Gray family described their bond as sisterly, but there was nothing equal about it. When Clara turned 9, her name was entered in the plantation ledger beside a dollar value. Eleanor's name, written on the same page, had no price. In the Gray household, affection and ownership coexisted without contradiction. The family spoke of Clara as one of us, yet they insured her as property. When visitors came, she was introduced as Eleanor's girl, a phrase that seemed harmless at the time, but whose meaning could chill the blood when read with modern eyes. Eleanor was educated, Clara was trained. One learned to read, the other to listen. And yet, to those around them, their closeness was something to admire. In journals and letters, neighbors described the two women walking arm in arm through the garden, dressed in matching gowns. To them, it was proof that slavery could be kind, that love could bridge ownership. But the photograph told a different story if one looked long enough. Clara's hand, resting on her lap, is clenched, not relaxed. The lace at her collar is torn, almost invisible, unless the image is magnified. And though her posture mirrors Eleanor's, her eyes are not looking toward the camera. They are looking past it, as if at someone standing behind. For nearly a century, the image lay hidden in a family trunk. It was rediscovered in 1981, when a historian named Dr. Natalie Chen, working through the University of Chicago's collection of antebellum portraits, stumbled upon it by accident. At first, she saw only the beauty, the symmetry, the composition, the grace of two young women frozen in time. But when she read the accompanying label, her breath caught. It read, Eleanor Gray and her companion Clara, taken on the veranda, summer of 1857. Companion, that word. It seemed harmless, but in the language of the 19th century, it meant something else entirely. It was the term used by families to describe enslaved women who attended their mistresses not as servants, but as mirrors. They were dressed alike, trained alike, and made to perform an illusion of equality, a companionship that soothed the conscience of the owners and silenced the suffering of the owned. Dr. Chen began to dig deeper. She found letters, account books, diaries. She found a receipt for one satin gown for Clara, to match Miss Eleanor. She found notes describing their travels from Louisiana to New Orleans, then north to Baltimore. And she found, in one of Eleanor's surviving letters, a single line that stripped away the pretense of friendship forever. She loves me as she must. By the time Dr. Chen published her findings, the photograph had already taken on a life of its own. It appeared in journals, in exhibitions, in debates over history's morality. Some called it a symbol of forbidden love. Others saw it as evidence of the most intimate cruelty imaginable, the ownership of affection itself. Yet what disturbed Chen most was not the exploitation. It was the beauty. The way the image had been composed to seduce the viewer into believing it was harmless. It was not violence that the photograph depicted, but peace, and in that peace lay the deepest horror of all. Because that was the genius of the system, it made cruelty look like care. It made obedience look like devotion. It made a photograph of slavery look like friendship. That single image, two women beneath the Louisiana sun, became a mirror for the nation that had taken it. And when the light hit it just right, what it reflected was not the past, but the present. When Dr. Natalie Chen first laid eyes on the photograph, she could not have known that it would lead her down a path lined with ghosts. The image itself was a fragment, a sliver of memory that had somehow survived the rot of time. But she knew instinctively that photographs never tell their stories alone. They leave traces, invoices, letters, signatures, and receipts. And the truth always hides in the paper. She began her search in the most unlikely place, a crumbling attic in Baton Rouge, where the last surviving descendant of the Gray family still lived, Margaret Gray Beaumont, a woman in her 80s with eyes as sharp as the pins that held her silver hair. Dr. Chen arrived unannounced. The house stood alone at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by pecan trees and silence. The porch boards sagged, the windows clouded with age. When Margaret opened the door, the smell of dust and cedar spilled out, like a memory refusing to fade. They spoke in the parlor, beneath portraits that watched without warmth. Dr. Chen mentioned the photograph. For a moment, Margaret said nothing. Then, almost reluctantly, she nodded. "That picture," she said softly, "has followed this family for generations. My grandmother kept it in a drawer. My mother burned the rest, but she couldn't bring herself to destroy that one. I think she wanted to remember, or maybe she wanted to be remembered." Margaret led Dr. Chen upstairs to a narrow attic lit by a single, grimy window. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper. Boxes lined the walls, each labeled in a faded, looping hand: household, correspondence, ledger, personal. And there, beneath a stack of moth-eaten quilts, was a trunk bound in iron straps, the kind built to survive time. When they pried it open, the hinges shrieked like something alive. Inside were hundreds of letters, folded, sealed, and tied with silk ribbon. Most were addressed to Eleanor Gray. A few bore no name at all, only the initials, C.G. Dr. Chen felt her pulse quicken. The ink had browned with age, but the words were legible still. And as she read, she began to see the life behind the photograph come into focus, a life lived between affection and possession. The letters from Eleanor were full of the small dramas of plantation life dinner guests. Weather, gossip from New Orleans. But Clara's words, written in the same delicate script, carried a different tone. They were formal, measured, and filled with careful omissions. Every sentence seemed built upon silence. In one letter, Clara wrote, "Miss Eleanor has taken ill with fever. I have sat by her bedside each night. When she wakes, she calls for me first, though the doctor forbids her to speak. I think she fears the silence more than the sickness." In another, the mistress says I may accompany her to the city. I am to wear the blue dress again, the one that matches hers. I do not like how people stare, but she says it gives her comfort. It was a portrait painted in obedience, but between the lines Dr. Chen found rebellion. In certain places, Clara's hand had trembled, leaving ink blots that obscured single words. In others, her sentences stopped mid-thought, as if someone had entered the room while she wrote. And on one sheet, torn, water-stained, half-erased, Dr. Chen found a single sentence that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "I am loved, but I am not free." Weeks turned into months as Dr. Chen pieced the archive together. She read by lamplight until dawn, surrounded by the whispers of history. The more she uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. Eleanor adored Clara, but not as an equal. She adored her as one might love a favorite possession, a reflection of her own gentleness, a mirror polished with submission. In the winter of 1858, Eleanor wrote to a cousin in Baltimore, "Clara will not marry, though I have promised her a good man from the stables. She says her place is here, beside me. I think she has come to love me too much." But in another letter, one never sent and found still folded in Eleanor's journal, she confessed a truth darker than affection. "I have seen her looking at the river sometimes. She stands there for an hour, motionless, as though the water might carry her somewhere I cannot follow." By 1859, the tone of the correspondence changed. The country was moving toward war. Whispers of abolition reached even the quiet corners of Louisiana. The Gray family began to sense that their world, the only one they had ever known, was ending. Eleanor wrote less often. Her handwriting grew erratic. And then suddenly, the letters stopped. The last entry in the ledger that mentioned Clara was dated April 1861. Transferred to New Orleans under escort. Purpose unknown. After that, her name vanished. Dr. Chen searched every record she could find: birth, death, census, but Clara Gray simply ceased to exist. As though she had never been. As though the photograph was her only proof of life. And yet, sometimes history leaves traces where logic expects none. In a shipping manifest dated June 1861, Dr. Chen found an entry. One female servant, age 23, freed by private arrangement, passage paid to Philadelphia. The handwriting was the same as Eleanor's. No signature, no surname, just an initial C. If the entry was genuine, it meant Eleanor had freed Clara on the eve of the war. But if that was true, why had she kept the photograph? Why preserve an image that immortalized the very inequality she had tried to undo? Perhaps guilt demanded it. Perhaps love, or perhaps both. Dr. Chen returned the letters to their boxes and sat for a long time in the still attic air. She imagined Eleanor, old and broken by war, holding that photograph in her lap, staring at it as the world she had built burned around her. She imagined Clara, somewhere in the north, walking freely for the first time, but carrying memories that no emancipation could erase. and she realized then what the photograph truly was. It was not a record of friendship. It was an artifact of control. A captured moment, designed to look gentle, so that the cruelty behind it could live forever, without protest. The photograph had lied. But the letters, patient and fragile, had finally told the truth. That night, Dr. Chen sealed the letters in acid-free envelopes and labeled them by hand. Gray Family Archive Companion Slavery Documentation. As she packed the last box, she noticed a single loose paper at the bottom of the trunk. It was unsigned, written in a hand, different from both women. The ink was faint, but the words were clear. What is remembered is never gone. After months among the Gray family papers, Dr. Natalie Chen began to understand that the photograph of Eleanor and Clara could not be an accident. The image carried too much deliberation. The matching dresses, the posture, the balanced composition. Someone had arranged it with purpose, and if one family had commissioned such a portrait, others must have as well. So she went south again, following whispers through archives and auction catalogs, down corridors lined with the fading scent of varnish and old air. She visited Charleston, Savannah, Natchez, Mobile, each place still shadowed by the memory of wealth built on ownership. In every museum basement she asked the same question. Do you have photographs of mistresses and their attendants taken together? Most curators shook their heads. Some frowned, unwilling to hear what she was really asking. A few led her into storage rooms where the past slept uncomfortably in numbered drawers. And there they were, more of them. Women in silks beside women in cotton, always paired, always poised. The enslaved seated just slightly lower, eyes turned not toward the camera but toward the one they served. The symmetry was perfect, the distance infinite. One archivist in Georgia unfolded a small daguerreotype wrapped in tissue paper. We thought they were sisters, he murmured. Dr. Chen studied the plate. The woman on the left wore a brooch of ivory, the one on the right a copy carved from bone. The imitation was flawless until you looked closely at the clasp, where the cheaper metal had begun to corrode. Another photograph surfaced in Alabama, a plantation daughter leaning her head against the shoulder of a darker woman dressed identically. Across the bottom, in graceful handwriting, someone had written, "My dearest Anna, ever faithful." By the time Dr. Chen returned to Chicago, she had cataloged 43 such images. They came from different states, different years, but the language of composition was the same. These were not coincidences. They were rituals. She began to see a pattern emerge. In the parlors of the antebellum South, the wealthy had developed a quiet fashion, portraits of their companions, arranged to soothe conscience and display refinement. It was slavery dressed as sentiment. Each photograph performed a lie. That affection could erase power, that ownership could look like love. Dr. Chen assembled the images on the floor of her office. The faces stared up from the past, calm and resigned. She noticed how the light always favored the mistress, falling full upon her features, leaving her attendant half in shadow. The eye of the camera, like the society that used it, knew where its loyalty lay. In a letter to a colleague, she wrote, "They are the same photograph taken 100 times. The repetition is the confession." She traced the photographers, traveling portraitists who moved from town to town, promising refined likenesses to prosperous families. Their ledgers listed appointments by the dozen, but only a handful of surviving images named the enslaved. The rest were described in polite euphemism: servant girl, companion, maid in costume. One name appeared repeatedly: Silas Morel, a photographer from New Orleans whose studio operated from 1852 to 1859. His advertisements boasted a family tableau of uncommon grace. Dr. Chen found his plates in private collections, misfiled among domestic portraits. In several the same props appeared: a wicker chair, a vase of camellias, a painted backdrop of a river and distant hills. The backdrop was never real, but the river was. It was the Mississippi, that patient witness to everything America tried to bury. In the winter of 1990, Chen curated a small exhibition titled The Lost Companions. It opened in a narrow gallery on the university campus. Only a few dozen people came that first week. The photographs hung in a single line, uncaptioned, identified only by place and year. The air inside was heavy, reverent. No music played. Visitors whispered, then fell silent. Some wept. A few grew angry, insisting that the images could not mean what she claimed. They said friendship was friendship, that not every story must be tragic. But when they leaned close, they saw what Chen had seen: the tension in the hands, the distance in the gaze, the half-smile that was not consent, but survival. Reporters came. Museums called. The exhibit traveled to New York, then Atlanta. In every city, debate followed about memory, guilt, and the thin line between beauty and complicity. One critic called it a sermon made of photographs. Another said it was an accusation whispered through glass. Dr. Chen answered neither praise nor anger. She only said, "History is not kind or cruel. It is exact. We must decide what to feel." The deeper she looked, the more the pattern widened. In one archive, she found a tintype labeled Mrs. Winters and her friend, Julia. Julia's surname was absent. In another, a stereograph titled The Ladies of Fair Haven. The back bore a note in pencil. She insisted they wear matching ribbons. Each image was a variation on the same composition, a choreography of dominance disguised as grace. Chen realized that what united them was not just aesthetics, but psychology. The owners needed to believe they were loved, and photography, that new and miraculous invention, offered proof. In her notebook, she wrote, "These pictures were not made for memory. They were made for denial." The collection grew until it filled an entire room. 43 became 70, then 92. Some arrived anonymously in the mail. Envelopes with no return address, postmarked from towns she'd never visited. Inside were small daguerreotypes and notes that said only, "Found this in my grandmother's attic." Each delivery was another confession from a family that had carried silence too long. Each photograph added another verse to the same dark hymn. And then, one morning, a package arrived without a letter. Inside was a single glass plate, cracked at the corner. When she held it to the light, Dr. Chen saw a faint reflection of her own face, mingled with two women from 1857, the original image of Eleanor and Clara. Someone had printed it again, decades after its rediscovery, as though to remind her that history is never finished with us. That night, she stayed alone in the gallery long after closing. The photographs glimmered faintly in the emergency lights, each a window into a silence too deep to measure. She thought about the people who had stood before the camera, their breaths held, their eyes open to eternity. She wondered if they knew that one day strangers would look upon them and see not beauty, but bondage made still. The air felt colder then, as though the past had drawn closer to listen. she whispered into the quiet. "I see you now." The reply, if there was one, came only as the soft crack of settling wood. The exhibition, The Lost Companions, had begun as a historical inquiry. By its third year, it had become something else, a pilgrimage. People came not only to see the photographs, but to measure themselves against them. Descendants of the families whose names appeared on the captions stood beside the glass cases, uncertain whether to bow their heads or lift them. Teachers brought students. Preachers brought silence. A few visitors left offerings, flowers, folded notes, a strand of hair. None of these gestures appeared in the catalogues. They belonged to that private language of grief that history never learns to speak. Dr. Chen watched from the edge of each crowd. She never guided or explained. The pictures did that themselves. They were patient teachers. They told the truth slowly, as truth always must. At night, after the gallery closed, she would walk among them in the dim blue light of security bulbs. Her reflection moved across the glass, merging with theirs, an uninvited witness inside their world. Sometimes she imagined the sound of their breathing, the faint rustle of skirts, the click of the camera shutter, held forever in the moment before release. She understood then that the photograph had not lied entirely. It had simply shown more than anyone wished to see. The lie was not in the image, but in the comfort people took from it. In her final paper, published a year before her death, Chen wrote, "Every photograph is two mirrors facing each other, the subject reflecting the photographer and the viewer reflecting themselves. Between those mirrors lies the truth, infinite and unbearable." She traced the idea further, arguing that these portraits were not mere curiosities, but moral instruments. To look at them was to feel the distance between what was and what was said to be. The women in the frames had endured that distance all their lives. Now, the living must endure it in turn. In the spring of 2001, the exhibition reached Washington, D.C. A storm knocked out the power the night before opening. When the lights flickered back, the guards found condensation on the glass of every frame, as though the room had been breathing. Dr. Chen, arriving at dawn, wiped the fog away with her sleeve. "Even memory sweats," she whispered. The show opened on schedule. It drew crowds beyond expectation. Historians praised it as revelation. Critics called it an accusation made beautiful. A senator attended, then quietly left after 5 minutes, his eyes wet. At the closing reception, someone asked Chen if she believed the spirits of the photographed women lingered there. She smiled faintly. "I don't believe in ghosts," she said. "I believe in consequences." When she died 2 years later, her colleagues found on her desk a sealed envelope labeled "For the Archive." Inside was a single print, the original Montgomery photograph. Across its back, in her precise handwriting, she had written, "To be displayed without caption, beside a mirror." And so it is. Today, in the National Museum of American Memory, the photograph hangs alone in a quiet alcove. Opposite it stands a polished mirror, unframed. Visitors approach expecting explanation, but there is none. They see two women from 1857, and then they see themselves, caught in the same rectangle of light. The room has no music, only the slow rhythm of footsteps and the faint hum of air through the vents. Yet some visitors claim to hear a whisper, soft, measured, almost kind. "She loves me, as she must." Outside, in the museum courtyard, a plaque bears Chen's final line. The photograph that lied told the truth at last, because we learned to listen. The wind turns the leaves. The glass glints briefly with sunlight. The faces inside remain unchanged. They no longer ask to be believed, only to be remembered. This was Deep Night Whispers. Tonight, we opened a file that was never meant to be found, a photograph that disguised ownership as love, beauty as silence, memory as mercy. But light, once captured, cannot lie forever. And when we dare to look long enough, the past looks back,